If someone is picturing a Jew, it's almost always an Ashkenazi one. And that's because of the roughly 7 million Jews in America, only about 500,000 aren't Ashkenazi. But that's not true across the world. In Israel, the majority of Jews are not Ashkenazi. And yet most Americans don't know the first thing about other types of Jews, specifically Sephardic culture. So in no particular order, here are 5 surprising differences between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. Before getting into the list, a quick review of who these two groups are. Ashkenazi Jews originally came from Germany, France, and Eastern Europe, while Sephardic Jews originally came from Portugal and Spain, and later lived in all of these places. Notably, there's a lot of overlap in who lived where, and not all Jews neatly fit into these two categories, not by a long shot. Mizrahi Jews, for instance, are largely from the Middle East, and they share many customs with the Sephardic Jews. So much so that in Israel, many think of them as one group. And then there are Ethiopian Jews, Italkim, and many others. But in America, these are the two biggest groups of Jews. And living in these separate areas created many differences, beyond just the shade of the color of their skin. Number 1, the food. Bagels, matzo ball soup, gefilte fish, kugel, all Ashkenazi. They come from countries where Ashkenazi Jews used to live, and they're still served in those countries under different names. Think cold weather Eastern European fare. Arafina, shakshuka, mufleta, all Sephardic. Coming from warmer countries, they're often more colorful and might actually be spicy. In other words, both groups have taken on and adapted dishes from the countries where they lived. There are foods that both groups eat, such as variations of challah and cholent, but even those can look quite different. And importantly, both groups have a long tradition of keeping kosher, the Jewish dietary rules. But even within that, there are notable differences. On the holiday of Passover, for instance, while neither eat bread, Ashkenazi Jews also don't traditionally eat kitniot, which includes all of these. It makes for very different dishes at the Seder. It also means that on Passover, there are some Ashkenazi Jews who aren't able to eat at Sephardic Jews' houses if both are traditionally observant in their own way. Jews can go their entire life without realizing there's a whole other variety of Jewish recipes that they didn't know existed and look nothing like the dishes they grew up with. Number 2, the prayers and music. The prayer services of both groups have the same structure and greatly overlap in terms of wording. But even though most of the wording is the same, the melodies are quite different. Here's an Ashkenazi one.
Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu.
And here's a Sephardic one.
Shema Yisrael.
Elements of the synagogue, such as how the seats are arranged, are also quite different. You can even hear the cultural influences in popular music in Israel through the years. Many of the Israeli folk songs come from Ashkenazi tunes. And today, Israeli pop music has a lot of Sephardic and Mizrahi influences. Number 3, the languages. Yiddish, which combined Hebrew with German, was only spoken by Ashkenazi Jews. So they were the ones busy noshing and kvetching. What chutzpah! Sephardic Jews had a variety of other languages, including Ladino and Chakatiya, which, in part, combined Hebrew and Spanish, to name just a couple of the many languages. Both Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews continued to maintain Hebrew, but even there they had different ways of pronouncing certain letters and words. Many learned Hebrew in order to both pray and to understand the holy texts, like the Torah. These days, both sides mostly speak the language of the country where they're living. Number 4, the laws and traditions. Jewish laws go all the way back, predating the split between the Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities. So they share many of the same laws. The general rules around kosher and Shabbat, for instance. But for hundreds of years, even if there was always some communication between the two sides, the two groups developed independently. At one point in the 1500s, it was incredibly difficult to sort through and understand which exact Jewish laws to follow. So at roughly the same time, both the Sephardic and Ashkenazi communities started working on collecting their own set of rules into one place. For a while, neither side realized the other side was simultaneously working on a similar project. When the rabbi on the Ashkenazi side realized that he was writing a competing book rather than creating two separate law books, he decided that he'd instead write an add-on for the book recently published on the Sephardic side called the Shulchan Aruch that called out the variations between the Sephardic and Ashkenazi traditions. And it meant that in most cases, they could share the same set of rules. Here's just a couple of examples of the many rules and customs, minhagim, that are different between the two groups. Sephardic Jews will name a child after a living relative, whereas Ashkenazi Jews will only name a kid after someone who has passed away. Also, Ashkenazi Torahs look like this, and Sephardic Torahs look like this. At weddings, only Sephardic brides traditionally get henna, and it's only Ashkenazi brides who circle the groom 7 times. We can make a whole top 5 list of just different wedding traditions. Number 5, the movements. This difference is more abstract, getting to the very heart of who these two groups are. Most often, when Americans think about the different types of Jews, it has to do with the denominations, such as Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. But this separation between the movements only happened on the Ashkenazi side. The Reform movement splitting off from traditional Judaism was, in part, influenced by the Protestants recently splitting off from the Catholics. To Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, they had no such reference point. They developed in a completely different manner. To quote Micah Goodman, the movements and counter-movements that complicated Jewish identity in Europe barely touched Jews in the Muslim world. While Jews faced serious troubles under both Christian and Muslim rule, only one of those sets of circumstances led to a division between Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Jewry. The influence of local environments then went beyond what people wore or what Jews ate. It colored the very way in which they saw the world. Today, these are not two groups geographically isolated from each other. There's a lot more interaction between the two. For instance, when Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews marry each other, they have to choose which family customs to follow. And in interacting and discussing these unique differences, the Jewish people continue to grow together. Despite the many differences, both sides share a core connection to the rest of the Jewish world. There's something special so many Jews feel when they meet other Jews elsewhere in the world. It allows a traveler to jump into a local Jewish community in another country, excited to find a synagogue or hear Hebrew, even if it's quite different from what they're used to.
Is it being Jewish or Judaism a race, or is it an ethnic religious group? The answer is it's both. So in Judaism, under the religion of Judaism, people who have a mother who is Jewish are born Jewish. As far as whether this makes you particularly Jewish in practice, that's a different question. Usually the "well, I'm Jewish" argument gets brought up in two contexts. One is where people actually practice some form of Judaism or hold it as a deep part of their identity, and so they have some credibility to speak on it. And one is when people use it in the United States, use it as an excuse to not be labeled part of the white majority. No, I'm sorry, you don't get to claim your ethnic Judaism as some form of minority status, given the fact that you have no association with Jewish practice or Jewish ideas. So Judaism is both, and that makes for a confusing conversation. But the truth is, it's only both because of religion. There are lots of different types of Jews. The common thing they have is a history with Judaism. The sort of ethnic composition of the Jewish people is pretty diverse, in the same way that Christianity is pretty diverse. There are a lot of Christians of various different races.
Can someone convert to Judaism? Question 101.
101.
Answer?
Yeah.
Actually, interestingly enough, although you can convert to Judaism, Judaism does not encourage people to convert. Come convert to Judaism, because Judaism believes that every human was born with the soul that they needed. Jewish soul, not a Jewish soul, and that's their purpose in this world. However, if someone really, 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 really wants to, then they can.
They have to take upon themselves all the 613 commandments that apply today.
So to keep a Torah lifestyle, and
It might take a few years.
actually taught that a person converted to Judaism technically had a Jewish soul to begin with. Was born with a soul that was...
And they come from a higher level.
Yes, and so, yeah.
The great Einsteins of the Jewish people, prior to the present day, were all rabbis, and they were all focused on the Bible and examining and illuminating the words of the Bible, the stories of the Bible. And because of these great ones, we have the Talmud, and we have the Midrash, which is the oral traditions which illuminate the stories and the verses of the Bible. And we also have the land. Extraordinary wealth of energy comes from the land itself. Every stone has a story here. So let's enter into our journey.
Talmud, or the oral tradition as it is called in many cases, gets its authority in 3 different ways, and I'll try to summarize them quickly. The first is that much of what God told Moses over the course of 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai was not recorded in the written text that God gave him that we know of as the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses. A lot of it was just taught to Moses orally, and Moses was expected to teach it to his students, who were charged with transmitting it to their students, and so it went through the generation. Hence, it's called the oral tradition. So the Talmud seems to be espousing laws that aren't in the book, the written book of Torah, but that's because it's transmitting an oral tradition that traces its way back to Moses at Sinai. So that's number 1. Number 2, the Talmud does engage in quite a bit of exegesis, where they infer laws from particular passages in the Torah that don't necessarily seem to be saying that on the surface. Where does it get its authority to do that? The answer is, when you listen to an hour-long lecture and take notes, I could probably read those notes in about 5 minutes flat. But if I read it, I won't really get everything you got from listening to the lecture. I'll have to come to you and ask you and say, these 5 words, what are they code for? What's the background? And you'll need to tell me your coding system. That when you say algebra, you're referring to the following 3 lectures that we heard from our lecturer back in April. And now I understand the background, but all you wrote was algebra. If you say ocean, you're referring not just to a particular ocean, but you're referring to oceanographics, you're referring to the currents, you're referring to storms, but that's just one word and it's code. So when God gave Moses the written text, he embedded into that text much of the oral tradition that is later espoused by the Talmud. And I must add, the Talmud just documented it. It was taught by many generations of sages and teachers. Each one who was given the code, God gave Moses the code. And then Moses shared that code with his students, who shared it with their students. Hence, the Talmud engages in all these exercises in which they infer or derive one law from another, one teaching from a different passage, because they understand the code of hermeneutics, the code that tells you what each word means and how to read it, how to spell it out, what the background to each of these words might be. Finally, the third level of Talmudic authority comes from what we call rabbinic decree, where the rabbis are authorized in the book of Deuteronomy to legislate laws that are not part of the Torah law. They're not part of the biblical mandate. They are rabbinically mandated. But the Torah authorizes the Talmud, the Torah authorizes the sages to legislate new laws. The role of these new laws are often to protect the old. It's kind of like putting a fence around a swimming pool to make sure that no one falls into the pool. So when you have a particular prohibition and you want to make sure that no one ever comes close to transgressing it, you make 1 or 2 additional prohibitions to expand the prohibited area and make sure that no one ever comes close to transgressing the original law. The book of Deuteronomy authorizes the rabbis to legislate such laws. That's where they get the authority for this last and third segment of Talmudic law.
Many critics of the Bible say that there's no proof for Jesus outside the Bible. In the Talmud, Sanhedrin 43 of the Jews, they record Jesus as a troublemaker who was crucified on Passover, exactly as the New Testament describes. The Jews didn't write this to prove Jesus. They meant these words as an indictment against him. The problem for unbelievers is that these records of the Jews proves in their own historical records that Jesus existed and was crucified, just as the eyewitnesses of the New Testament record this event. This is one of the pieces of evidence that proves the New Testament is true.
And this is why it's so interesting, because when I read the New Testament myself, and I obviously am not a believer in the divinity of Jesus, but when I see what Jesus actually has to say about the Old Testament, it seems to me very similar to the stuff that Zechariah is saying, or that Jeremiah is saying. Right? Jeremiah says that the sacrifices themselves are basically of no use unless there's actual meaning behind the sacrifices. God wasn't there because he likes the barbecue, right? It actually has to have some meaning. And when Jesus comes along and he says, you're focusing in on all the details of the Sabbath without actually recognizing the rationale for the Sabbath. And then he exaggerates it beyond the point. It's interesting.
Without loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength.
Right, exactly. And then he even, to make a point, exaggerates it beyond the scope of what Jewish law would permit. So, for example, when he says, you're going to leave a guy to die in a ditch on the Sabbath, that's against Jewish law. You can't do that. You have to violate the Sabbath in order to save a life. This is like basic black-letter Jewish law. But he's making a point, which is, you guys are ignoring what's important in order to focus in on the mundane aspect of practice. Like that's not unique to Jesus. In other words, there's a long prophetic tradition of people saying exactly that. And in the modern Jewish world, it's called Musar. It's basically just telling people what they should understand about the values beyond the black letter law. And this is why I think it's fascinating to me when I talk with people who are real biblical scholars from the Christian side, that all the I won't say all, a lot of the areas where Christian scholars think that Christianity has departed dramatically from Judaism, I think are not really dramatic departures. They seem to be reflections of Judaism from a slightly different angle. Even so far as a lot of the stuff in the Sermon on the Mount about, love, when it says that you're supposed to love thy brother as thyself, and you're supposed to treat your brother as you would wish to be treated, and all of this. I mean, that's present in the Old Testament too.
No, right? I think what Jesus did in the Sermon on the Mount was elevate the teaching of the rabbis. Elevate it. He went above them. He said, well, you've been told you shouldn't commit adultery. I'm telling you, if you look at a woman to lust after her, you've committed adultery in your heart. He got to the heart of the law. They were content with the practical application of the law. He was not content with that. So I would say that Jesus was the purest Jew that ever lived because he understood the elevation of the law to the heart and the soul. It would be a monstrous responsibility for some committee to have invented Jesus. When you hear even the people in his time saying, never a man spoke like this man, that he is a person that doesn't seem to have been a product of human invention. And you could say, well, Jesus is a good teacher, but good teachers don't claim to be God. They don't say I and God are one. They don't say I created the universe. That's not a good teacher. That's somebody who's crazy, as a lunatic, or somebody who's trying to pull off a huge deception. So you cannot come to Jesus and just patronize him as a noble, good Jewish teacher, because he crossed a line. He crossed a severe line, and the Jews saw that. Either he's the Messiah or he is a blasphemer, and he needs to be put to death. And those are really the choices you have. So when you ask me to show the variation between Judaism and Christianity, morally, no, there's none. And in terms of God, we don't have the same God as Muslims. Allah is not the same God as Jehovah. We don't have the same gods as any other false religion, but we have the same God as Jews and Christians. He is the one true creator God, the one true living God. He has a deity. That is, he is eternal by his own nature. He is uncreated, the uncreated one. We believe he is more than one person in one God. That's why Genesis says, let us make man in our own image. And relationship comes from a God who has relationship within himself. But the distinction between Christianity and Judaism is what we do with Jesus Christ. The writer of Hebrews says, if a sacrifice had been enough to atone for sin, they would have stopped making them. But they never stopped. Morning and evening, morning and evening, morning and evening, morning and evening. Basically a priest was a butcher. He had blood up to his waist. Right? I mean,
That's true.
he was a butcher. He had blood up to his waist. And the frustration of it, even on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, all the bloodletting, and year after year after year after year, this goes on, this goes on, this goes on. You have this most amazing thing. You come to the death of Jesus Christ, and at the death of Christ, the veil in the temple is rent from top to bottom. The Holy of Holies is thrown open. Wow, that's a statement from God, because it couldn't have been ripped by men from the top down. The way to God is open. There's no more barriers because a suitable sacrifice has been found. This is the Lamb of God. And amazingly, soon after that, the whole sacrificial system ends, because that's the final sacrifice. And God validates that sacrifice by raising him from the dead. The resurrection is a provable historical fact. So I think that's the issue. It's what do you do with Jesus?
Why have the majority of Jewish people rejected Jesus? Reason number one is it is simply an emotional, knee-jerk reaction that they have to Jesus because they believe that you can't be a Jew and believe in Jesus. They simply believe that being a Jew is not believing in Jesus. It's not based on logic. It's not based on an analysis of the Scriptures, at least an honest evaluation of the Scriptures. It's simply based on a traditional, cultural position that they've taken that goes all the way back to the time that Jesus walked on the earth. Reason number one, then, that Jews reject Jesus is simply they believe they have to, because part of being Jewish is rejecting Jesus. Reason number two that Jewish people reject Jesus. Jewish people feel that God should not be illustrated or should not be contained in any type of image. Because when God first revealed himself to the Jewish people on top of Mount Sinai, they didn't see God. They saw his glory. They saw the fire on top of Mount Sinai. They saw the smoke. But they didn't see God. And when God gave the Jewish people the law there, he said to them in the commandments, do not make any graven image of anything in the likeness of what is on earth. To a traditional Jewish person, God cannot take on the form of a man. But to me, as a Jewish believer in Jesus, this analysis is faulty and it is not as deep as the Scriptures go. Because in fact, we read in the Torah that God actually appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre in the form of a man. So as a Jewish believer in Jesus, I'm not saying that God is a man. I'm saying that God clothed himself in humanity. Just as the New Testament teaches in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. But Jewish people, because they're trapped in the mindset of rabbinic Judaism and believe what the rabbis tell them, they are not open to understanding the deeper mystery. Reason number three that Jewish people reject Jesus is because a misunderstanding of what Jesus taught about the law. You see, what the rabbis teach is that Jesus did away with the law, that Jesus broke the Ten Commandments. For example, we read in the Gospels that Yeshua was walking through a field one day on the Sabbath, and he picked grain up on the Sabbath, and he was accused of harvesting or working on the Sabbath. And so Jewish people reject Jesus because they feel that Jesus rejected the law and tried to do away with the law. But in fact, that's not what Yeshua did. He kept the law. Again, he said, I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. He kept the law, beloved, in its truest and in its original intent. In other words, he kept the law in the sense that he did in the law what was meant to be done that pleased the Father that gave the law. And ultimately, he fulfilled it because the law's true intent was to cause mankind to recognize that we are not, in and of ourselves, capable of keeping the law to perfection. At the end of the day, our heart is not true enough, it's not pure enough, it's not perfect enough to meet the demands of the law. And recognizing that, we are now prepared to receive God's ultimate answer, which is the Messiah, King Jesus, King Yeshua. So in review, Jewish people reject Jesus because, number one, they're taught to by osmosis. Number two, they've been taught from the rabbis that God can't be a man. And number three, they think that Jesus broke the law. None of those things are true. Yeshua is God in the flesh that perfectly kept the law and fulfilled God's ultimate purpose from eternity.
You accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. You are not Jewish anymore, but now a Christian follower of Jesus.
Yeah, I don't think that you can stop being Jewish just for believing in Jesus. That'd be kind of like reducing down being Jewish. Being Jewish is so much more than, what you think about Jesus, right? It's such a rich culture and experience, and it's our family, and it's our history and our legacy.
Judaism is a religion, but being Jewish it's our ancestry. You can't un-Jewish a person. And like I said, I love saying this. I go to Jerusalem sometimes and I have conversations with Orthodox Jews. They all say, every single one of them, I would never say that you're not Jewish anymore. I'd say you're wrong, but I wouldn't say that you weren't Jewish. And